The letter arrived on a quiet evening, tucked beneath her door as though someone wanted it to be found, but not explained. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, with her name written in flowing ink she didn't recognize. She hesitated before opening it, running her fingers across the paper as though it carried a secret heartbeat of its own. When she finally broke the seal, a delicate card slipped out, its golden edges catching the dim light of her small apartment. It was an invitation to a gala, the kind of event she had only ever seen on television or in glossy magazines. The handwriting was formal, the location an opulent hotel in the heart of the city, and her name was written as though she belonged there. For a moment, she laughed to herself, thinking it had been sent to her by mistake. She was a school teacher with bills piled higher than her paycheck could reach, a woman who spent her days in chalk dust and evenings sipping tea from a chipped mug. She did not move in circles where champagne flowed like water and diamonds glittered as casually as raindrops. Yet the more she stared at the invitation, the harder it was to shake the strange pull it had over her. She told herself she would not go. It was a world that had nothing to do with her. But that night she barely slept, the image of glittering chandeliers haunting her thoughts, a whisper in her mind that maybe, just maybe, there was a reason her name had appeared on that card. By morning, her decision had shifted. She would go, not because she belonged, but because some part of her needed to know why she had been chosen. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. She searched her closet, only to find dresses far too plain for a room of millionaires. In the end, she borrowed a gown from her friend, a flowing midnight blue that shimmered faintly when the light touched it. When she stood before the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Nervousness tightened her chest, but beneath it was something else, an energy, an anticipation she couldn't name. On the night of the gala, the city glittered like a jewel as she approached the towering hotel. Limousines lined the entrance, their doors spilling out men in crisp tuxedos and women draped in silks and jewels. She stepped from the cab she could barely afford, clutching her small purse like a shield. For a moment she thought about turning back, but then she saw the golden light spilling from the glass doors, and she forced herself forward. Inside, the world seemed unreal. Crystal chandeliers floated above, scattering light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. The air smelled of roses and champagne, and the sound of a string quartet mingled with the low hum of laughter and conversation. She moved carefully, aware of every step, her pulse quickening with each glance from strangers who seemed to measure her and find her out of place. Still, she did not falter. Something about the invitation had whispered that she was meant to be here, even if the reasons remained hidden. She felt the weight of unseen eyes, watching her with curiosity, and in that instant a shiver traced her spine. She could not have known that somewhere across the room, a man in a tailored suit had turned at the exact moment she entered. His gaze lingered on her, steady and unyielding, as though he had been waiting for years for this very night. She smoothed her hands across the fabric of her borrowed dress, her nerves nearly unbearable, unaware that fate had already wound its threads around her. Tonight would not be like any other night she had lived before. It was the beginning of something vast and unstoppable, a story she did not yet realize she was stepping into, and somewhere in the glitter and shadows of the grand ballroom, someone she bears, Lai remembered, was already waiting for her, ready to alter the course of her life forever. She stepped deeper into the ballroom, her heart pounding so loudly she feared others might hear it. The chandeliers above bathed the room in golden light, and every corner seemed alive with murmurs and secrets. She had never seen so many people dressed in wealth that glittered like armor, women in gowns that caught the light with every movement, and men whose eyes scanned the crowd with calculated sharpness. She felt small, a single fragile thread woven into a tapestry far grander than anything she had known. Yet she could not shake the sense that she was meant to be here. Across the room, he stood, the millionaire who seemed both part of this world and yet untouched by it. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black that fit him with effortless power, he carried an aura that silenced conversations as he passed. She did not know his name, yet there was something hauntingly familiar about him, something in the way he watched her that pulled at memories she could not reach. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and it was as if the rest of the room dissolved, leaving only the two of them caught in an invisible current. She quickly looked away, unsettled by the intensity of his gaze, but wherever she moved, she could feel it, steady and unrelenting, like the heat of a flame. Whispers rose among the guests, hushed voices that traveled faster than she could follow. Who was she? Why was she here? Why had he, a man who rarely acknowledged anyone, turned his attention to a stranger in a borrowed dress? The weight of their curiosity pressed down on her shoulders, making her breath shallow. The string quartet began a slow, aching melody, and couples drifted toward the center of the floor. She stood at the edge, half hidden by the towering arrangements of roses, wishing she could disappear into the shadows. Then the crowd parted, and he walked toward her. Each step seemed deliberate. Each moment stretched too long, until the air itself grew tight with expectation. People stopped talking. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The ballroom held its breath. When he reached her, he offered his hand without a word. For an instant, she considered refusing, afraid of what it would mean to be seen with him, afraid of what she might feel if she touched him. But something in his eyes, deep and unreadable, demanded her trust. Her fingers trembled as she placed her hand in his. The moment their skin met, a shiver surged through her, as though she had touched not just a man, but a memory buried inside her. He led her to the floor, and the music rose around them. His hand at her waist was steady, firm, guiding her with a control that felt both protective and consuming. She could not look away from him. His presence was overwhelming, his silence louder than any words. Every turn drew her closer. Every step wrapped her tighter into the mystery of who he was and why he had chosen her. Gasps rippled from the crowd. Never before had he danced with anyone in public. Never before had he broken the icy distance that made him untouchable. The room swirled with shock and speculation, but she barely heard it. All she knew was the rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his chest, the heat of his gaze, and the undeniable pull that left her breathless. Yet beneath the beauty of the moment, a question gnawed at her. Why her? Why now? Why did it feel as though this dance was not the beginning but the continuation of something long unfinished? A shadow of suspense settled over her heart, whispering that this night was only the surface of a secret that had waited years to rise. The music slowed, but her pulse did not. As the last notes of the violin faded, the guests erupted in a soft storm of murmurs. Their whispers carried like smoke, impossible to capture, but heavy with meaning. She tried to steady her breath, but the intensity of his gaze kept her rooted in place. He did not release her hand, even as the other dancers stepped away. It was as if he had decided she would not leave his side until he willed it. He bent slightly toward her, his voice low and controlled, carrying just enough to reach her ears through the noise. "You shouldn't be here," he said. The words sent a chill across her skin, though his tone was not one of warning, but of something deeper, something she could not decipher. She wanted to ask what he meant, but his expression silenced her. His jaw was sharp, his eyes like storm clouds, and yet there was something fragile hidden within them, something that made her chest ache. Before she could speak, a man appeared at her side, an older guest with an impatient smile. He addressed the millionaire directly, his voice edged with false charm. "Surprising choice for a partner? She's not from our circle, is she?" His words cut through her composure, and she tried to step back, but the millionaire's hand tightened protectively at her waist. His eyes hardened, and the older man faltered, quickly retreating with an embarrassed laugh. She wanted answers. Every second with him felt like walking deeper into a maze where the walls closed tighter with each step. Why had he chosen her out of everyone? Why did his stare feel like recognition when she had never met him before? Or had she? There was a tug at the edge of her memory, a flicker of a moment from years long gone, but it slipped away before she could grasp it. He guided her off the dance floor, through the curious eyes that followed their every move. They reached a quiet corridor beyond, at the golden arches of the ballroom. Here, the sound of music was distant, muffled, as though they had stepped into another world. He turned to face her fully, and for the first time, she saw the intensity of his struggle. It was in the way his hands clenched at his sides, in the way he opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. Finally, he said, "Do you really not remember me?" His words struck her like lightning. She searched his face, desperate for a clue, but nothing surfaced. The question itself was terrifying because it hinted at a connection that had been hidden from her all this time. She wanted to deny it, to laugh and tell him he was mistaken, but something deep within her whispered otherwise. Before she could respond, voices echoed from the ballroom. Someone was approaching, and he looked toward the sound with a sharpness that told her they were not safe to be seen together. He leaned closer, his breath brushing her ear as he whispered, "Trust me," before pulling her back into the dazzling chaos of the gala. She walked beside him, her heart in turmoil, every step heavier with suspicion. The night that had begun with curiosity now burned with suspense. Who was he? Why did he believe she had once known him, and why, in the depths of her heart, did she fear he was right? The ballroom seemed louder now, every laugh and every clink of glass pressing against her like a weight she could not bear. She followed him through the glittering crowd, her pulse unsteady, her thoughts tangled with questions she dared not ask aloud. He walked with purpose, each stride clearing a path as if the world instinctively moved out of his way. She felt small beside him yet strangely shielded, as though nothing could touch her while he remained near. He led her toward the grand staircase draped in velvet, past curious stairs that burned into her back. When they reached the upper landing, he paused, turning his gaze down at her with a silence so heavy it seemed to speak louder than words. Then, without explanation, he pushed open a set of tall glass doors that led to a balcony bathed in the cool night air. The sudden hush was overwhelming, the noise of the gala fading into a distant echo as the city lights stretched endlessly beyond them. She gripped the railing, grateful for the air, but before she could steady herself, he stepped closer, his presence wrapped around her, strong and consuming. He searched her face with eyes that revealed both longing and torment. "You kissed me once, long ago," he whispered, his voice raw with memory. Her heart raced violently. She shook her head, confusion flooding her. "That's impossible," she murmured, though even as she spoke, her chest tightened as if fighting to release something buried. For a moment, he said nothing, only watching her with an intensity that made her shiver. Then he reached for her hand. His touch was firm yet trembling, and when his fingers brushed hers, a spark of recognition shot through her. She gasped, her breath faltering. Images flickered in her mind. Laughter under a summer sky, a boy with eyes like fire, a promise whispered and then lost. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving her shaken and uncertain. Before she could pull away, he leaned in. His lips brushed hers with a suddenness that stole her breath. It was not a kiss of strangers, but of something remembered, something carried for years in silence. She froze, torn between resistance and surrender, but the depth of the moment pulled her in until her eyes fluttered shut. Time seemed to stop. The world below, the gala, the whispers, all disappeared. When he broke the kiss, his chest rose sharply as though he had revealed a secret too dangerous to speak. His voice was low, rough, trembling with restraint. "Tell me you feel it too." She stood in silence, her fingers pressed against her lips, her body trembling from a storm she could not explain. She wanted to deny it, to escape the truth he was forcing into her, yet deep inside she knew something undeniable had been awakened. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps shattered the fragile stillness. Two figures stepped onto the balcony, their voices sharp and accusing. "So this is why he brought her," one of them sneered. The other laughed coldly. "She is nothing more than a distraction." The words cut her deeper than she expected. The man at her side straightened, his hand tightening around hers, his voice suddenly edged with steel. "Leave her out of this." The intruders exchanged a glance, their smirks fading into silence as they retreated, but the damage had already been done. Her heart pounded with fear, suspicion, and longing all at once. She looked at him, searching for answers, but his face was unreadable. He only whispered one word, one plea that sent her deeper into the storm. "Remember." And in that moment, she realized that the kiss had not been an accident. It was a door he had forced open, a door she could no longer close. She could not breathe as she returned to the ballroom, her lips still tingling from the kiss that had both frightened and stirred her. The glittering lights seemed harsher now, every laugh sharper, every glance more cutting. She tried to steady her steps, but her mind was spiraling. The fragments of memory he had awakened refused to let her rest. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a face flickered, a boy who once looked at her with the same intensity, a promise whispered on a summer evening, a letter she had never answered. The pieces slipped away whenever she reached for them, leaving her restless and unsettled. The millionaire remained by her side, his hand firm at her back, as though he feared she would vanish if he let go. His silence was unbearable, filled with the weight of truths he was not ready to share. She wanted to demand answers, to shake him until he confessed why he looked at her as if she were his salvation, but the stares of the guests held her tongue. Every corner of the ballroom hummed with gossip. Every pair of eyes followed them like predators scenting weakness. She slipped away from him when the music swelled, retreating into a quieter corner where shadows softened the golden glow. Her heart pounded as she pressed a hand against her chest, whispering to herself that none of this made sense. But then, as if pulled by fate, she noticed a portrait on the wall, an old painting of the hotel's original Gala from decades past. Among the blurred faces of guests long gone, her eyes caught on a small detail. A young boy stood at the edge of the crowd in the painting, his features strikingly similar to the man who had just kissed her. She staggered back, the air catching in her throat. Before she could make sense of it, a voice startled her. "So you've found it?" She turned sharply to find an older woman at her side, dressed in pearls and carrying herself with quiet authority. Her eyes lingered on the portrait, then shifted to her. "He's been waiting for you longer than you know," the woman said softly. "But be careful, child. Devotion can turn into desperation when it waits too long." The warning struck deep. She wanted to ask who the woman was, but the figure melted back into the crowd before she could speak another word. Her knees weakened, the weight of the evening pressing down harder. She returned to the floor, her eyes searching for him, but he was no longer where she had left him. Panic rose in her chest until she spotted him at the far end of the ballroom, speaking urgently with two men in dark suits. Their faces were serious, their voices sharp, and the tension in his posture sent a chill racing through her veins. When his eyes found hers across the crowd, they softened instantly, as though the storm inside him could only be calmed by her presence. He excused himself quickly and came toward her, his steps swift, his face unreadable. She braced herself, her mind filled with too many questions. But before he reached her, a sudden crash echoed through the ballroom. A champagne glass shattered on the marble floor near her feet, followed by gasps of alarm. She froze, her breath catching as the crowd shifted in confusion. He rushed to her side, pulling her protectively into his arms, his voice a low growl as he demanded to know who had done it. But when she looked into his eyes, she realized something far more terrifying. The accident was no accident at all. Someone was trying to send a message, and as his grip tightened around her, she understood that the past he wanted her to remember was entangled with dangers she could not yet see. The ballroom settled again, but her heart did not. Even after the broken glass was swept away and the music resumed, she felt the eyes of unseen enemies watching her every move. He stood close, his presence both a comfort and a weight, shielding her from curious stares while keeping her tethered to him. She could not tell if his protectiveness was born of love or of secrets too dangerous to be revealed. He guided her to a quieter corner, his voice steady but edged with something she could not name. "Do not leave my side tonight." The words were a command more than a plea, and though she bristled at his tone, she could not ignore the urgency that burned in his eyes. As they stood together, he let slip fragments of truths, scattered like pieces of glass that hinted at a bigger picture. He spoke of a promise he had once made, of years he had spent searching, of choices that had carved him into the man he was now. His devotion was undeniable, but his silence about the full story left her with more fear than comfort. Every time she pressed for answers, he would pause, as though wrestling with chains inside his own mind, then give her only enough to keep her heart entangled. The night deepened, and she began to feel the weight of exhaustion pressing on her. Yet when she glanced at him, he looked as though he could endure forever, his gaze locked on her as if he had been waiting for this moment across lifetimes. She caught herself trembling beneath the intensity of it. It was not the gaze of a stranger. It was the gaze of a man who had carried her in his memory for far too long. But there was something else in that look, something that made her shiver, a desperation, a hunger that was not just about love, but about fear, fear of losing her again. She wanted to ask what he meant when he had whispered, "Remember on the balcony," but before she could speak, a group of guests passed by, their voices sharp with cruelty. "She is nothing but a schoolgirl dressed in borrowed silk," one of them sneered. The others laughed, the sound cutting through her like a blade. She turned away, ashamed, but he caught her chin gently, forcing her eyes back to his. "Do not let them touch you with their poison," he said, his voice low and commanding. "You are more than any of them could ever dream to be." His words burned into her, fierce and protective, but they also frightened her. How could he see her with such certainty when she could barely recognize herself tonight? As the evening stretched, she noticed subtle movements around them. Men in dark suits positioned themselves at the edges of the room, their gazes flicking constantly toward the millionaire. Their presence was not casual. They were guards, but not his. She could sense it in the way his jaw tightened whenever he caught sight of them. Danger was closing in, and she was caught in its center. At last, when the crowd began to thin, he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "There are things you must know, but not here." His words were heavy, urgent, and final. "Tomorrow," he promised, "I will tell you everything." Her heart ached with both dread and longing. Tonight had shown her glimpses of devotion that felt eternal, but it had also revealed shadows deeper than she had ever imagined. As he led her out of the ballroom, his hand firm around hers, she realized she was already entangled in a story that stretched far beyond a single night. And for the first time, she wondered if his love, carried silently for so long, was the very thing that might save her, or destroy her. The morning after the gala carried a silence that felt heavier than any noise. She woke with the memory of his kiss still lingering on her lips and the echo of his promise in her ears. "Tomorrow," he had said, and now tomorrow had arrived. Yet the quiet of her small apartment felt like a cage, every creak of the floorboards a reminder that her life was no longer the simple one she had known. Something vast had opened before her, and she could not go back to pretending it was not real. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. A single line appeared on the screen. "Meet me at the old library before noon." It was unsigned, but she knew instinctively who had sent it. Her heart leapt between fear and anticipation. The library had been closed for years, a forgotten monument of the city, abandoned and filled with dust and secrets. Why would he choose that place unless what he wanted to reveal could not risk the light of day? She dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she locked the door behind her. The streets seemed different now, as though shadows had grown longer and whispers followed her footsteps. Twice she thought she noticed someone trailing her, a man with a dark coat who disappeared into the crowd each time she turned. By the time she reached the gates of the library, her nerves were stretched taut. The building loomed before her, its once proud stone facade now cracked with age. She pushed the heavy doors open, their groan echoing into the vast silence inside. Dust drifted through shafts of broken light, and every step across the marble floor echoed like a drum beat. She was not alone. From the far side of the room, he emerged, his presence filling the empty space with an intensity that made her breath falter. He did not waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he placed a worn leather box on the table between them. Inside lay a collection of photographs, letters, and a small silver pendant. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she lifted the pendant into her palm. The design was simple, but it carried a mark she recognized deep in her bones. She had seen it once as a child, on a necklace that had been pressed into her hand during a night of chaos she had tried to forget. He watched her closely, his eyes raw with emotion. "Do you remember now?" His voice was steady, but beneath it she heard the cracks of a man who had waited too long. She stared at the pendant, flashes of memory rushing back with frightening clarity. A boy who had shielded her from danger, a promise whispered in the dark, a night when everything had changed. She gasped as the realization struck her. It was him. He was the boy she had lost in the shadows of her past. But before she could speak, a sudden crash echoed from the upper balcony of the library. Figures stepped into the light, men in black suits with eyes sharp and merciless. She froze, the pendant still clutched in her hand, as one of them spoke. "You should have stayed hidden. Now it's too late." The millionaire moved instantly, placing himself between her and the intruders. His voice was no longer soft, but steel-edged. "You will not touch her." The tension thickened, every second drawn tighter, the promise of violence hanging in the air. She realized then that the truth he carried was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. It was not only love that had bound him to her all these years, but also enemies, shadows that had followed him since the night he first saved her, and now those shadows had finally found her too. The silence inside the library shattered like glass as the intruders descended the staircase. Their footsteps echoed with cruel patience, each step meant to remind her that escape was impossible. She clutched the pendant in her hand so tightly it pressed into her skin, her breath shallow as fear crawled up her spine. The millionaire stood firm, his shoulders squared, his gaze burning with a defiance that dared anyone to come closer. One of the men, tall and sharp-eyed, stepped forward with a mocking smile. "Years you've hidden this truth," he said. "Years you've kept her from knowing. Did you really think you could keep her forever in the dark?" His words twisted through her chest like a blade. She turned to the man she had kissed on the balcony, her heart desperate for answers, but his face was set like stone. The intruder's gaze flicked to her, cold and unyielding. "She doesn't know, does she?" He smirked as though savoring the cruelty of the moment. "She doesn't know the lengths you went to just to bring her here. She doesn't know this whole night was your design." Her stomach dropped. She looked at the millionaire in horror. The invitation, the dance, the kiss, the strange way he had spoken to her as though she were someone lost and found again. It had not been fate. It had been orchestrated. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Tell me they're lying." He flinched at her words, and that small flicker of pain in his eyes was answer enough. He had done it. Every step, every whisper of the night had been carefully built to draw her into this web. The betrayal cracked her chest open, but before she could step back, he reached for her hand, his voice trembling with desperation. "I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted you to remember." But the intruders did not wait for her heart to decide. They moved swiftly, circling like wolves. The millionaire shoved her behind him, his voice a command. "Run." She shook her head, her feet frozen to the marble floor, but the fire in his eyes left no room for hesitation. When the first intruder lunged, he met him with a force that sent both crashing into the dust and shadows of the library. She stumbled backward, her hands shaking as the sound of struggle filled the room. The pendant glowed faintly in the fractured light, and as she stared at it, more memories surged, his hand pulling hers through smoke, his voice promising he would find her, his young face streaked with blood as he shielded her from harm. The truth ripped through her. He had been there all along, he had saved her once before, and he had built his life on a vow to do it again. The fight ended as suddenly as it began. The intruders retreated, their threats lingering like smoke. "This isn't over," one hissed, before vanishing into the night. The millionaire stood breathing heavily, bruised, but unbroken. He turned to her, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. "Now you see why I couldn't stay away." She trembled, torn between fury and longing. She had found proof of his love stretching back through time, but she had also uncovered the truth of his deception. He had dragged her into a story written long before she understood it, a story filled with shadows that wanted her silenced. And as she met his gaze, she realized the most terrifying part of all. His love might be the only thing keeping her alive. The night outside the library was restless with wind, but inside her chest the storm was louder. She could still hear the echo of the intruder's threats, still see the desperation in his eyes as he stood between her and danger. Her body trembled with fear, but it was her heart that carried the heaviest weight. The truth he had hidden now pressed against her like a chain she could not break. He had loved her for years, but he had also deceived her, weaving her into a fate she had never chosen. She pulled away from him as they stepped into the street, her voice breaking with anger. "You planned all of this. You knew I would come. You didn't give me a choice." His jaw tightened, his silence sharper than any denial. Finally, his voice cut through the cold air, low and heavy with sorrow. I couldn't risk losing you again. Her breath caught. Again. That single word thundered inside her. He had spoken of their past, of promises made long ago, but the way he said it now carried a darker meaning. What else had he hidden? What else had she forgotten? Before she could press him, headlights flared at the end of the street. A black car rolled slowly toward them, too deliberate, too controlled. Her pulse spiked. He grabbed her hand and pulled her into the shadows of a narrow alley. The car slowed, its tinted window sliding down just enough for her to see a face in the darkness. A man with eyes like knives. His voice carried across the wind. She will remember, whether you want her to or not. The car drove on, but the warning lingered, thick and suffocating. She turned to him, her hands shaking. Who are they? Why are they after me? He hesitated, his silence louder than the city around them. Finally, he spoke with a voice that sounded like confession and plea all at once. They know what you saw that night. They know you hold the truth that could destroy them. Her mind reeled. Fragments of memory stirred again. Smoke, shouting, a boy's hand pulling her through the dark, the glint of something dangerous before everything went black. She pressed her hands to her temples, the pain of remembrance clawing at her. He steadied her, his voice urgent. Let it come back. Stop fighting it. But she did not want the memories. She feared them. What if remembering meant stepping fully into the danger she had barely escaped as a child? What if his love was not enough to save her this time? The sound of footsteps echoed down the alley, snapping her out of thought. Shadows stretched long against the brick walls as figures approached. He pulled her close, his body a shield, his eyes burning with determination. You wanted the truth, he whispered. Tonight you'll have it, but you must trust me. Her heart raced as the shadows closed in. Suspense tangled with dread, yet somewhere beneath the fear was the undeniable pull of the bond between them, a bond that had survived years of silence and secrets. She realized then that the moment of choice had come. She could either step away from him forever or step deeper into the storm that had been chasing her since the night she was a child. And when the first shadow lunged forward, she knew she had already made her choice. The alley erupted into chaos. Shadows lunged from both sides, their movements swift and calculated, but he moved faster. He pushed her back against the wall, his body shielding hers as the first man swung. The blow never landed. With the strength of a man driven by something deeper than survival, he struck back, his fists sharp, his movements relentless. She tried to cry out, but the sound caught in her throat as the fight unfolded in a blur of fists and darkness. One of the attackers reached for her arm, yanking her forward. She struggled, clawing against his grip, but then a memory burst through her mind with violent clarity. She was a child again, smoke choking her lungs, strangers shouting, the same kind of grip dragging her into danger. And then a boy had come, wild-eyed but brave, pulling her away, whispering a single vow in her ear. I will always find you. Her scream tore through the night as the memory fused with the moment. She shoved the man away with every ounce of strength she had. The millionaire fought harder now, his rage sharpened by her cry, his strikes fueled by the years he had carried that vow in silence. One by one, the attackers fell back, retreating into the dark, with threats still hissing on their tongues. This is not over. She is marked. The alley fell silent again, the wind cutting through the space where violence had just reigned. He stood panting, his hands bloodied, his eyes burning with both fury and fear. She stepped toward him, her breath ragged, the silver pendant still clutched in her palm. You saved me then. You saved me now. Why didn't you tell me sooner? His face broke open with pain. Because I was afraid, he confessed, his voice raw. Afraid that if you remembered too soon, they would come for you again. Afraid that if you knew how long I had loved you, you would see it as a burden instead of a gift. Her tears blurred the city lights, but she did not look away from him. All this time, she whispered. All this time you carried it alone. He nodded, his shoulders heavy with years of silence. From the moment I pulled you from the fire, I have lived for you. Every choice, every battle, every mask I wore, it was all for the promise I made." The truth settled between them, sharp and unshakable. He had loved her not for days or months, but for years, shaping his life around a vow she had forgotten. And now that vow had drawn danger back to her door. But instead of fear, she felt something else rising inside her. Strength. She stepped closer, her hand lifting to his cheek, her voice steady despite the tremor of her body. "You were wrong. It is not a burden. It is the only truth. I trust tonight." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as though her words had freed him from a prison he had built himself. For a long moment, there was no sound but their breathing, no world but the one they stood in together. When he opened his eyes again, he was different, softer, yet stronger. "We cannot go back," he said. "They will keep coming. But if we face them together, they will never break us." She nodded, the pendant warm against her chest. The memories of the past no longer felt like chains. They felt like roots, binding her to the boy who had once saved her and to the man who had carried that love through fire and shadows. Hand in hand, they stepped out of the alley and into the uncertain night. The city stretched wide and dangerous before them, but for the first time, she did not feel alone. Suspense still lingered, the promise of battles ahead pressing at the edges of their story, but so did something greater. Love that had waited, love that had endured, love that would not let go. And as the wind carried away the last whispers of the intruders, she realized the shocking truth. The kiss at the gala had not created their story. It had simply awakened what had always been there, waiting for her to remember.